Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm Nigel Sizer, the Chief Program Officer with Rainforest Alliance. I have eaten a lot of Impossible Burgers. They are absolutely delicious, but we are going to serve up something even more delicious right now, which is another panel with 3 more speakers, and we're going to talk about radical collaboration. And you can't all get burgers at the same time, so some of you might want to stay in here and let others go first. We've heard a lot this morning. About the problems and some of the solutions. This session is really going to focus on the solutions. Around the Global Landscape Forum, there's just an extraordinary proliferation of creative efforts to conserve, restore landscapes, to improve the lives of the people who live there. But even so, when you add all this up and put it on the map, it's still only a small fraction of what is actually needed. And there is a huge challenge of how do we achieve scale in this work? How do we scale the impact of these efforts? And in this session, we're going to share 2 initiatives that are in the process, making good progress in figuring out how to do that. The first of those looks at the persistent question of how do we actually measure progress? How do we even know when we're succeeding in a landscape to have impact, social, environmental, governance, economic? And how do we compare and learn across landscapes that are achieving different degrees of progress? And that initiative is called LandScale. The second one is the question of how do you streamline and dramatically reduce the cost of scaling up local landscape partnerships and their success. And that initiative is called 1,000 Landscapes for 1 billion people. And common to both of these initiatives is what we call radical collaboration, which is an open-hearted and truly inclusive approach to partnership that really does balance the local partners and the global partners in the governance and management of these efforts. Now, we need to start this journey, therefore, with an actual landscape. And I am really delighted, therefore, to introduce Felipe Carazo, the former director of Fundecor, which is a Costa Rican NGO instrumental in developing environmental services initiatives, including the famous Aguatica Water Fund, which was the first water fund in Costa Rica to increase water quality and quantity in the central volcanic mountain range landscape, which covers an area of 5,000 square kilometers. Felipe has been a consistent and long-standing innovator in this space, and he's going to give us a short overview of the Aguatica initiative and some of the key lessons and issues that emerged from it, which will then be addressed by the other 2 speakers. Felipe, would you like to speak from here? If you'd like to come up here, you can be more energetic. Yes, Felipe, go ahead. And I'll go.
Thank you. Good day to everyone. Minister, great to see you. Thank you, Nigel, and to the panel. I'm going to pick it up from where the minister left it. He made an enormous and a very powerful presentation that showed how Costa Rica has been able to really turn things around in terms of managing the land use. Well, it hasn't been easy, but aside from that, Costa Rica is very much aware that we have other challenges, that although we've really advanced on the green agenda, we have to make efforts on the blue, the brown, and the gray agenda. And that's why we, led by the minister and by President Alvarado, have set up a decarbonization plan that's extremely ambitious. Why do I say this? Well, to really start to move in that direction, we have to build from what we have achieved, which is what the minister talked about. So to do that, there's a lot of complexity. We've achieved a lot of impact on the ground, on our rural areas, by working directly with the landholders. Now, when you start to look into other variables linked to blue, brown, or gray agendas, it's more complex. You have to get involved private sector, consumers, cities, the interface between the city and the rural areas. And that's where a landscape, which is basically 2 sub-watersheds of the big watershed called Tárcoles, has been selected as the area to deploy and implement an instrument called Aguatica. That landscape, those two subwatersheds, are basically the main central valley of San Jose, of Costa Rica, where you have the San Jose, the capital. It's an area where we have 50% of our population, where we have 75% of the economic activity. So in that area, we're trying to deploy instruments that allows us to create an interface between our natural-based solutions, our implementations on the ground, and the city dynamics. We have done that by really targeting and creating a landscape intervention. And this is extremely important because through landscape interventions, we can really grab the institutionality that has been built up, grab the resources that we already have at hand, and try to maximize them in a new arrangement that allows to mobilize other resources. Aguatica, briefly speaking, is basically a water fund in which we try to enhance water quality and water quantity by creating a private-public instrument through which public resources allow to mobilize private resources. We were able to engage private stakeholders. We've been even able to engage companies, the bottling company of Pepsi, the bottling company of Coca-Cola, in a pre-competitive approach to join forces, mobilize resources for what the public sector cannot address. But they will do that and help mobilize the private sector to orient those interventions as long as the public sector is able to be very transparent and efficient in the use of other mechanisms that exist, such as water tariffs and water cannons. So the entire instrument, which I'm not going to get into detail, bases its work in a very detailed model, scientific model that mobilizes information. That model has as its cornerstone the landscape intervention. Through that, we can really start to identify how we're going to orient reforestation, payment of environmental services schemes in that area in order to maximize not only the carbon stock returns, but also the water provision returns. But at the same time, how do we address agricultural good practices? So this comes to what the minister was expressing. You know, how do we create channels of collaboration, dynamic channels of collaboration, underground channels of collaboration between stakeholders in both fields that allow us to maximize interventions and results? The landscape approach allows us to do the metrics, allows us to set the conditions and the variables through which we can do the interventions and mobilize the stakeholders, and therefore build up the governance structures that set up the arrangements between the different stakeholders, and then finally be able to create the financial instrument. Because there's an important question here. You need resources. And this is something that Costa Rica tries to tackle every time that we go into these experiments and efforts. How do we create good economic resource approaches? So I just want to leave it like that. One of the important reasons that we've been able to start to tackle these things, and hopefully these allow us to have a better engagement of citizens in cities that are able to understand the importance of nature-based solutions, and at the same time engage in other processes within the brown and the gray agenda. The landscape approach is instrumental to be able to manage these complexities, and that's part of why we are highly encouraging the support of processes that replicate landscape knowledge across the board. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felipe. Is this working? Yes. So thank you very much, Felipe. So building on that, which is one of many experiences at the landscape level, I'd now like to welcome Jeff Milder, who's going to talk about LandScale. Jeff is the Director of Global Programs with Rainforest Alliance, formerly was our Chief Scientist, has many years of experience leading efforts to innovate in this space. Jeff.
Thank you, Nigel. Very good afternoon to all of you, and warm greetings to those joining us from live stream around the world. I think that Aguatica provides such an inspiring example of landscape restoration based around a fundamental human need, in this case, water. And now a new chapter is about to be written, because Fundacor and their partners have joined a new initiative called LandScale so that they can make their landscape collaboration even more fruitful. So today I'd like to tell you about LandScale and how it's working to drive landscape sustainability at scale. In the case of the Aguatica landscape, The partners' goal is to begin to involve more land users from around the landscape and also to address socioeconomic issues more directly. They also want to bring in more different funders and investors beyond those focused on water. And they want to better align the different initiatives going on in the landscape, not just the Water Fund, but also sustainability efforts in the coffee sector, Costa Rica's low emissions livestock sector plan, and others. But to support this greater and more radical collaboration is going to require something new. And that new thing is a common language of success for landscape sustainability, by which I mean a common way of understanding how a landscape is doing, whether things are getting better or worse, and how to interpret these patterns and trends. Because we all know that we cannot manage what we're not able to measure in clear and commonly accepted ways. And this is where LandScale comes in. At the center of LandScale is the idea that trusted and holistic information about landscape performance and trends can unlock new incentives and stronger collaboration that will help power landscape sustainability. Of course, sustainability metrics are not new. Already today, we heard about some really exciting new work on restoration monitoring. So the work of LandScale is to build on these and other resources to create this common language of success, to bring these together in a holistic way so that we can understand landscape sustainability from the multiple dimensions of environment, economics, social well-being, and governance. But more importantly, we need to take this holistic approach and make it operational. We need a working system that can be used by diverse actors and applied in hundreds and thousands of landscapes around the world. That's how we get to scale, which is what we absolutely need to do if we want to meet the ambitions laid out at this meeting. Holistic and trusted information on landscape performance does three things. First, it allows landscape actors to reach a common understanding about risks, barriers, and opportunities to sustainability. And we heard very clearly from Mr. Rodriguez that if we want to bring together these different ministries that have such differing worldviews, we really need this. Second, it provides a basis to inform decisions about different types of landscape management interventions that might be under consideration, public policies, land use plans, private investment, and so forth. And third, and perhaps most importantly, it allows well-performing landscapes and those who contribute to this progress to be recognized for these results, and then to gain benefit from this recognition. And this is super, super important, because if we can get to the place where sustainability consistently yields economic benefits and political benefits, then it's going to take off under its own momentum like a ball rolling downhill. And again, this is what we need if we want to get to scale. Trusted information on landscape performance does one more essential thing. It helps to overcome the barrier to engagement by actors that sit distant from one another or from the landscape itself. We've heard already today from several speakers about the importance of private business and investors in fashioning the solutions that we so urgently need. But our research has shown that these external stakeholders, and especially the private sector, are actually among the least involved in multi-stakeholder landscape processes, even though their activities may have the greatest impact on landscapes. So the investor sitting in Hong Kong, the commodity buyer sitting in London, the mining company in Montreal, these companies, these organizations may all be key influencers of a rural landscape in Peru, but they're very distant from the landscape itself. LandScale provides an entry for them to get involved through the lens of the things that matter to their company, such as assessing sustainability risk, targeting procurement or investment, and demonstrating the impacts of their activities on the ground. So, what does it take to build a system of trusted information on landscape performance? LandScale has three main elements. The first is a rigorous assessment framework covering four key pillars of sustainability related to ecosystems, human well-being, governance, and production systems. This draws on existing data sets and indicators, which can be complemented with primary data where necessary. And while there's certainly value in standardizing landscape sustainability assessment, this is not at all a one-size-fits-all approach. Local stakeholders can select context-specific indicators linked to their own priorities and local issues, and these are layered on top of a common core of topics related to global priorities like reducing land-based greenhouse gas emissions and protecting biodiversity. The second element is a verification mechanism through which auditors and peer reviewers can check and validate LandScale assessments. This provides the needed element of credibility and trust. And the third element is a data and reporting platform through which stakeholders can document, analyze, and visualize data on landscape performance and trends, essentially providing a manager's dashboard on landscape sustainability. We're developing LandScale through a consultative process, and in order to make this initiative as impactful as possible, we need the input from landscape leaders and experts like all of you. The first draft of the LandScale tool is currently available for public consultation until October 15th, so please check it out at landscale.org and provide your input. As we build LandScale at the global level, we're also testing it on the ground, not only in Costa Rica, also in Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, and Ghana. And in a few months, we're going to put out a call for additional landscapes to be early testers of this tool. So we hope some of you will consider taking advantage of this opportunity. By the end of 2020, we expect LandScale to be fully operational so that it can be applied to support landscapes around the world. Breakthrough innovation sometimes means bringing to life a very simple idea. In the case of LandScale, that simple idea is that holistic and trusted information about landscape performance can be the key to unlock stronger incentives and greater action.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nigel, and it is a pleasure to be here with all of you, including all of you who are joining us remotely. We've heard a lot today about what we need to do, but how are we actually going to transform our food systems, our ecosystems, and our economies in ways that fully meet the Sustainable Development Goals, the Aichi targets, the Bonn Challenge, the Paris Agreement? We have to reshape the way that people and nature interact. We need to develop regenerative economies and regenerative landscapes that store more carbon than they emit, that produce and make available to all enough food and shelter, fiber, and health, and healing for all human beings to live in dignity. And we need to provide plenty of habitat for all the other species that share this planet with us. To get there will require radical collaboration, doing things differently than we have. This is the premise of 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People initiative. I'd like to tell you about it and invite you to join us as one major way we could help advance the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So we had a wonderful example from Costa Rica that Felipe provided of a robust integrated landscape initiative, and I want to share with you another one. Earlier this month, I was in India, and there the transition to regenerative economies and landscapes is an urgent one for tens of millions of people. This is a picture of the Kaveri River Basin, one of the grand rivers of India, where river flow has declined by 40% as the basin has lost 87% of the trees and vegetative cover that were protecting the watershed. With drought being experienced in 15 of the last 18 years, conventional economics and modern farming practices have actually left fields dried up and barren and farmers in despair, suicidal, and in deepening cycles of debt. But people do not take this lying down. They have been inspired to work together to redesign their land-based economy in a way that's more consistent with their local culture and with their local ecosystems. The state government of Karnataka, with the help from the Isha Foundation's here, I think, has formed a partnership to restore one particular part of the Kaveri Basin. They have recruited partners from farmer cooperatives, from civil society, wildlife sanctuaries, from universities, from district governments, and many other actors, and worked really hard over the last 14 years to achieve some remarkable results, with more than 80,000 farmers in transition toward perennially based agroforestry systems and a shift in the whole agricultural economy towards these objectives. Now they have an ambitious plan to move to 5 million people and to restore the full flow of the Kaveri River by transforming their agricultural economy. We've documented hundreds of these kinds of large-scale landscape initiatives around the world with different entry points and different names, but each one uniquely reflecting the local conditions and aspirations of people there. What is it that these landscape groups actually do? We've been talking about multi-stakeholder partnerships. Well, they set up platforms for dialogue and action among people who may not necessarily like or trust one another, but recognize that their interactions are affecting the resource base and what they can generate from that. They're learning from one another the whole picture of what their landscape looks like from the different perspectives. They're hashing out and negotiating a shared vision and ambitions for that landscape long-term, intergenerational. Negotiating a strategy to get there, and developing an action plan that the different groups can buy into. And then they organize, fund, and coordinate those landscape action plans. And then they monitor those actions to see what they can learn and how they can improve the piece moving forward. We are incredibly inspired by the number of landscape initiatives that are doing these things. However, in today's world, it is extremely difficult for these landscape partnerships to achieve those ambitious objectives. How does Cavalry move from 100,000 farmers to 5 million farmers? It's going to require radical collaboration. To meet their needs, a coalition of organizations has come together now to catalyze transformational regeneration in 1,000 landscapes benefiting 1 billion people that are on the march by 2030. We'll work together in a spirit of radical collaboration within and across landscapes to promote 3 specific systems changes that we think will be catalytic. The first one is to empower decision-making by locally led landscape partnerships. This approach will be embodied and modeled in the way the initiative operates and how it's governed. All the other organizations are going to shift the way they do things to support the landscape initiatives. Secondly, we will develop a digital landscape action platform. This will be designed in close collaboration with diverse landscape partnerships to find ways that we can harness the information technology revolution to sharply reduce the costs and greatly increase the effectiveness of these landscape partnerships. This has been done in the health sector and many other sectors, but we're 2 decades behind in the land use sector, particularly integrated resource use. This platform will help partners communicate within the landscape more effectively, store information so everyone can access them, track the landscape action plan and its impacts in real time, connect producers to markets, access global and local data that can be used for planning, and access the best tools and expertise like LandScale, which Jeff just described. The third systems change that we will be promoting is to make financing radically easier for landscape initiatives to access. This has 2 parts. One is that we'll help landscape actors to build a portfolio of robust investments in different sectors across the landscape that together produce synergies and avoid trade-offs in the ecological and economic flows within the landscapes. And the second element is to mobilize the finance that they need for those investments. We're going to work with innovative financiers to design financial mechanisms that provide not just $5 million for one project in a landscape, but $5 billion for a portfolio of projects across that landscape that have synergies and, most importantly, that reflect the vision of the local people about what they want in their landscapes. We'll advance 2 kinds of institutions. One of them are landscape financial mechanisms, maybe landscape banks, landscape funds. There's a number of innovative models that are being developed, and we'd like to see those grow. And also, the other side is financial support services, both for-profit and nonprofit, that are arising and could help to mobilize financing. Our approach is to developing the tools and strategies for 1,000 landscapes for 1 billion people is very heavily driven by the demands from the actual landscape partnerships in different parts of the world. They will design the goals, the criteria, and collaborate in the testing and evaluation as this is done iteratively over time. Only by pooling our ideas and efforts in a radical collaboration will this type of things work. The logos that you see here are the initial organizations. It's already a little out of date, I'm happy to say, committed to 1,000 landscapes for 1 billion people, and its key values, which is to be holistic, catalytic, inclusive, collaborative, and entrepreneurial. 1,000 landscapes for 1 billion people is moving to reimagine that relationship that we have between people and nature and our economies. We hope that many of you will join us in this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Now, I understand that the translators are going to have their impossible burgers as well. And so the very small number of you, I think, in the room who are using the translation are going to lose it. But I'm going to try and just take a couple of questions from the floor, if we can just keep going without the interpreters. Since this is not an official UN meeting, hopefully we're allowed to do that, even though we're in their space, which we really appreciate. So, would anyone like to ask a question? Please just grab a microphone. Yes, sir, please. Try and identify yourself and maybe try and push the button, see if it works, or just stand up and scream at us. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Gary Tabor from the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. We're based in Bozeman, Montana. My question is that to the Rainforest Alliance, which I love the idea of creating a consistency for measuring landscapes, have you created consistency for what a landscape is?
Jeff, why don't you take that one?
Oh, only easy questions from the floor. Thank you very much. Well, I think if we look at the different types of landscape initiatives that are out there and that have shown great success, they come with different conceptions of what a landscape is. A landscape is organized around different cohesive elements that make sense in that context. They could be political boundaries, they could be watershed boundaries, they could be ecological boundaries, they could have to do with patterns of where people live on the land. So within LandScale, there's 3 different ways a landscape can be defined. It can be defined as a jurisdiction, like a district or municipality. It can be defined as a watershed, typically a sub-watershed, or it can be a user-defined boundary where the local stakeholder groups draw the boundaries based on essentially what makes sense according to the problems they're trying to solve. So we do try to be flexible because if we're scaling, we need to recognize that things are different in different places.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Another question. Anyone? Yes, please, sir, and identify yourself.
Yes, I'm Rob Wheeler. I represent the Global Eco-Village Network at the UN. I want to thank Sarah and Jeff for the great things that you're doing. I drafted a paper that's on these back tables here. It's called Creating a Global Campaign to Restore the Whole Earth. And I tried to look at a holistic approach to the UN decade. The UN often creates these decades and then doesn't put in place sufficient programs and financing, et cetera, in order to achieve the goals they set. So I think the 2 elements that you are suggesting are perfect to help to drive this decade forward. And I referred to these ideas, but I didn't know you had these initiatives. So I'm curious as first, how can an organization like the Global Eco-Village Network, where we have thousands of local communities that are pretty small but are doing great demonstration work on the ground, how can they get involved with this? And the second part is, how can we support the creation of this platform, which will help to demonstrate the need and to raise financing and funds that could be available for local communities?
Thank you very much. Sarah, would you like to take that?
Sorry. Thanks very much for that question. Right now, the initiative is in this intensive co-design phase. We don't want to jump on board with things that we don't feel like a large number of landscape initiatives would find really transformationally useful. But while we're doing that, we are trying to collect and connect with some of the groups who would be potential users. So this is going to be done with a lean impact kind of, adapting a lean impact model, where we're going to go out there with some versions of it, try it in 10 landscapes, then 50 landscapes, and then 300 landscapes. And so I think we're going to be putting together a kind of a network mechanism whereby communities that might be interested in using these tools would be able to be involved, and also connect with organizations that can provide the capacity and support to do them. So please contact us. We're looking for partners, and really love to do that.
Thank you, Sarah. If anyone would like to know more about this, follow up with us in any way, please just give us your cards, and we will do that. Oh, great. Yes, we'll go. Let's quickly take these three. 1, 2, 3. Go ahead. Just to say who you are as well.
Hi.
And try and be brief.
Janine Yazzie, co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group, and one of the co-founders of the Gold Standard. For me, radical partnerships is a key component of radical partnerships is transforming power and power paradigms. And in our landscape work, where we use a watershed framework to promote what we mean by landscape scale management for water security and food security, oftentimes our biggest hindrances and challenges are the legal systems and the legal structures. And I'm wondering if in your work you have come across these same issues around land use policies and existing practices that are protected by outdated legal precedent and cases, and what you've done to navigate it.
Thank you, Janine, for that very important question. Just take a note and we'll keep collecting, yeah? Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Scott Francisco from Cities for Forests, one of the founders of that organization. So my question in terms of collaboration is, it seems that there's a lot of overlap between what different initiatives are doing, both at the same scale and at different scales. We heard from one, but I'm sure we could hear from 20 more in this room, which have roughly 50% overlap in terms of vocabulary and goals with what we've heard, which in one way is fantastic, and another way it's a little, you could almost say paralyzing, because it feels like lots of people are out there reinventing the wheel. And is anyone mapping the initiatives that have these common values, common goals, even just within the landscape approach umbrella? There's got to be dozens, if not hundreds, who are taking these same concepts forward.
Yeah,
how do we do that?
Thank you. Great question. We're taking note. We're definitely not paralyzed, by the way, but we'll hear more about that. Yes, go ahead, Brittany.
My name is Brittany. I'm a graduate student at the Yale School of Forests and Environmental Studies. And in full disclosure, I'm also an employee of the Rainforest Alliance. I'm curious to ask more about the verification component of LandScale and how you can ensure consistent measurements, both in terms of quality and recognizing that landscapes are gigantic and it's difficult to get representative measurements.
Thank you, Brittany. Okay, I think we're going to have to stop the questions there, and I'm going to go to each of our panelists and ask them to respond. You don't have to respond to all of them, whichever pieces you would like. Felipe, could we start with you, please, and then we'll come to Sarah and then wrap up with Jeff.
Thank you. Yes, I want to refer especially to the legal barriers question of the complexity of dealing with all these multiple frameworks, regulations that could impact, for good or for bad, a landscape. That's gonna be the case everywhere, always. There's no way we can have a control of how frameworks for governance based on different cultures affect the impact on the ground. So what I think the important thing here is what's the capacity of the landscape approaches, the landscape frameworks, the landscape networks to create a potent and strong enough concept that can be moved across the board that allows stakeholders on the ground to navigate those different specific dynamics they're going to encounter. It's not necessarily how you frame yourself in rigid systems, it's just how are you able to read situations to move around. And I'm just going to put an example. We were able to create the South-South Cooperation exercise with the Frane region in Morocco It's totally different. The way land use is managed, the titling rights, the community structures. But we were able to transfer our way of facing the issues and the problems to the Moroccans so they could go out about it. And the results that they were able to mainstream the importance of environmental services from a pragmatic standpoint. I'm just going to put it, just to go deep and give the microphone. They realized that if they would go into mechanisms, theory, there's a saying, I think it was Yogi Berra said, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're not, right? So they had a framework of action in that landscape that said you have to value your resources, and that forced them to basically start to think about charging peasants next to protected areas for the use of firewood and others, and that would represent an enormous social hampering issue. But by doing this South-South exchange and exercise, they were able to understand that they didn't have to tackle all the elements across the theoretical framework of intervention for capturing value for the resource management. They did, though, understood that they had cities like Fez that were getting the water out of Ifrane, which is this massive, mountain massive that gets the water, where they could build strategies with utilities and build upon that their intervention approach. So again, if the landscape approach is able to guide in this or provide guidance and parameters, it's going to be very significant, because the challenges that we face on the ground is how do you minimize the transaction cost to get these processes moving forward. They're extremely complex. And the better you can minimize those transactional costs by having good guidance, understanding the landscape approaches, the better off the deals could happen and the faster they could occur.
Sarah.
Sure. I wanted to start by saying, I was mentioning the 3 interventions of 1,000 land landscapes for $1 billion, and one of them goes directly to the power question. What we see is a real mobilization, even for all the good things that have been talked about today, that is being mobilized top-down, whether it's by governments or international NGOs or UN conventions. How can we turn the system around where the objectives are laid out by the local landscapes? They then negotiate with these top-down groups about where's the overlap and where they can really work together, but that the power and the funding is dedicated at this local level. I think the indigenous territories have actually been, many of them, advanced in moving some of those things. We have a lot to learn from how they've done integrated strategies. I did want to call out the gold standard as something that we're considering as one of the values underlying this landscape initiative. But I think that's something that we really need to look at how we operate, shift the way that donors work, shift the way financial institutions work, and shift the way governments work. The second thing that I wanted to actually speak to the overlapping initiatives piece. One of the things that we did at Eco-Agriculture Partners in collaboration with a number of research organizations between 2013 and 2017, and Jeff was actually one of the original designers of the survey work, but we managed to document about 428 different large-scale landscape initiatives that included agriculture, in sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, Europe, and Latin America and the Caribbean. Since that time, the numbers have dramatically grown. Many, many different communities of practice that are involved there. But I think there is an effort of mapping that's going on. The gentleman Gary Tabor, they've done mapping of landscape initiatives in the United States. But not only that, we're also mapping organizations. We know a lot of the organizations, it's probably still a fraction. And one of the things we're really trying to do with 1,000 landscapes for 1 billion people is not have it be another 10,000th landscape initiative. It's designed to be supportive, value-added, and to power all the landscape initiatives that others are doing by redesigning the way they get financing and redesigning the way they get information and can manage information together. So that's really what we're trying to do. And meanwhile, every time I turn around, I learn about a new landscape initiative and a landscape program. So it's a sign of greatness, but we go back to the theme of this session. They are not collaborating. It is incredibly fragmented. Where they do know another, they are competing with one another. And if we get leadership from the landscape initiatives, let them figure out who's going to provide the help to them in one way or the other. I think that's a possibility. So I'll stop there.
Thank
I'm sorry?
If you led with that, that would actually change the dynamic of like the feeling of support that you're there to support all of these other initiatives. Could be helpful.
I'll absolutely do that in the very next talk. Thank you.
Thank you for the feedback. That's great. Jeff, go ahead. Last word.
Oh, last word.
Almost.
Okay. Yeah, I'll speak briefly to the question from you about overlap, and also to Brittany's question. In the case of LandScale, we're trying to fill a specific gap, and we did a lot of scoping to identify that this really is a gap, and that's the question of measurement, particularly in rural landscapes that are commodity-producing landscapes. They're producing agriculture, commodities, forestry, aquaculture, minerals at scale. And what we see is in these places this issue where external companies and investors are not well linked into the local landscape processes is most acute. Earlier in this week, I spent some time at Nature's Climate Hub with groups of companies from the global north that have made commitments or are pursuing initiatives around landscape or jurisdictional sourcing or investment. And they lack the tools, really, to go to landscapes, to know what they should be investing in, to know how to demonstrate progress, to be able to show to their C-suite that those investments paid off. So this is where the tool is positioning itself. And in terms of how we do that, verification is a critical part of that because, again, these actors are very far from one another. So in a globalized system, that element of trust facilitates these transactions that we want to bring to scale. So please follow our process in terms of the details of the verification system, which we're still building. But those are going to focus around things like data quality, how we downscale data sets to landscape level, how we establish guidelines for collection of primary data so that it can be consistent and trusted as well.
Thank you very much, Jeff. So we need to wrap up now. Thank you so much for delaying your Impossible Burgers by a few minutes. Hopefully there's still some left. I'm sure there are. If not, you can buy them at 20,000 locations around the world, apparently. I want you to thank Felipe, Jeff, and Sarah. And if you'd like to find out more about any of this, please come and speak to us. Go to landscapes.global online, or go to the Rainforest Alliance website or the Eco Agriculture Partners website, which are very easy to find, and we will follow up with you. Thank you so much.